Good afternoon. Oh boy, this is scary. Oh, yeah. I was just wondering, you guys were here in the previous talk, was about joints. Am I right? Never seen people that are actually interested in joints and infectious diseases. I was just wondering, I really appreciate that, diversity. Yeah. First of all, I want to thank Floxergy. It's interesting, when they asked me, I was a little bit worried because they're going to ask me what to talk about. And they said, no, you can talk whatever you want. So I'm going to talk about my last vacation. I'm just kidding on that one. But this is a very unique opportunity. It's not about the content, it's about changing the dogma. And I'm assuming most of you deal with horses. Yes. Most of you deal with sports horses. And if you've seen how the industry has been shaken up in the past few years by outbreak, and it's generally one player, EHV1, and it's mind-blowing. Am I right? The way we look at horses today is different than the way we looked at them a few years ago. And if you look at all the restriction and recommendation and guidelines that are pushed at equestrian event, any event, they're generally based on that much scientific evidence. Am I right? So the question is, are we overstepping the boundaries? Are we just pampering these horses for a risk that is minimal? Or should we do more? And the only way for me to know that is really to put a metric to it, is to get data. And if you look at how much data we have, it's always the same question. What does a febrile horse at an equestrian, at a show jumping event mean? You get that call, horse is febrile. Does it mean that it needs to put in isolation? Do we need to test it? What does it mean? I don't know. I don't know what the distribution of febrile horses at an equestrian event looks like. I have no idea. What about silent shedding? Now, if you think about all these outbreaks, look at the Valencia outbreak. Hope nobody's from Spain here. It happened in the US too sometimes. We forget to wash our hands. Then you start thinking what we're seeing there is a tremendous outcome of a single pathogen. The procedures that we're trying to engage in to get the prevention after the event are tremendous and generally not necessarily a good reflection of the risk. So what I'm trying to share here and tell you is I'm gonna show you data that is not published that may potentially help us acquire some of that information to make educated decisions on how we want to handle these horses. So first of all, we're dealing with equine infectious pathogen. While EHV1 in the context of EHM is a relevant one, there are other fish to fry in the whole context of respiratory pathogen. We all agree on that. Some of them are called equine influenza, herpes 4, equine rhinitis A and B virus, as well as strep equi. I would say in the whole scheme of infectious diseases, strep equi has a greater financial impact than all the EHM outbreaks together on a yearly basis. That's a statement I cannot back up. Again, we need hard data here. The important part when we're dealing with these sport horses or adult horses in general, well, most of these horses are well cared, they get vaccinated on a regular basis. If you look at the clinical expression, they are not textbook. And I'm sometimes very surprised. You see a horse that if you wouldn't take the rectal temperature and realize that this horse is febrile, you wouldn't know that this horse is actually sick. We were part of an outbreak in 2021 of EHV1 infection, and the only way this outbreak was determined is the veterinarian was savvy enough to take a rectal temperature, doing a physical exam before sedating the horse, and realized that 75% of these horses actually were febrile, but these horses look absolutely normal. So what I'm trying to say is adult horses will make fools out of you. They will not have that typical presentation. Maybe a horse with nasal discharge, no fever, or a horse with fever only. If you're lucky, you get the whole set of clinical presentation. Now, one of the issues that we have in eliminating and controlling these viruses, which we will never be able to, and that's kind of good because that's job security, that's the way I look at it, is the fact that they continue to circulate silently within the horse population, and some of them also cause latent infections. It's very similar to SARS-CoV-2. It's never going to go away. that's a moot point, I know. Nobody wants to talk about COVID anymore. I get it. Okay, let's talk about the clinical case. The horse that presents with you acute onset of fever and respiratory signs. That's a red flag. What we're going to do, we're going to take a nasal swab and we're going to screen it. What we're going to use a screening tool, it's up to you. There's many modalities. Some of them are more sensitive than others. I would say PCR for panel strategy is a good way to go. You have to keep in mind that you don't get 100% hit. If we look at the biosurveillance, the data from the biosurveillance program that UC Davis has with Merck Animal Health, 1 out of 3 horses that presents with acute onset of fever and respiratory sign will be a hit. One of the 5 respiratory pathogens that are listed. That's kind of a lousy outcome, am I right? I mean, imagine if you were a surgeon, one of the 3 surgeries is going to be successful. You're not going to have the best reputation in town, am I right? So why is it? Is it a technology issue? Are we not good at swabbing these horses? Something else going on? And I would say it's probably all of the above. We're looking at these adult horses, not always, but most of them adult horses. So the window to collect the sample is relatively narrow. So we may be missing that narrowest window. We may also not have the appropriate sample. If you're looking at strep equi in an early stage or late stage, we know it's a whole different debate. Which sample type should we be using? I also want to consider that there are other pathogens, less characterized, but pathogens that probably play a role. I mean, looking at some of the gamma herpes viruses, what does it mean if a horse is positive for EHV2 and or EHV5? I honestly don't know. Again, we're lacking metrics. I mean, I went and finished and I graduated in 1991. I know I look very young. You guys can applaud to that and support me. I need the support, Otherwise, when I have to expend on purchase the expensive night creams. When I went to vet school, we had 4 respiratory pathogen, and that was in 1991. It was 30 years ago, and I'm still dealing with the same 4 respiratory pathogen. If you look at the human field, biodiscovery, that's a different story. I mean, almost every week there's a new pathogen that is discovered that plays a role alone or as a comorbidity. We can add serology. How many of you diagnose respiratory cases with serology? Sometimes it is useful, especially if you come off the aftermath, but it's hard in vaccinated horses. If you're trying to determine titers, it's very costly. You have to split your sample, different laboratories, and so on. Okay, I'm going to get to the topic sooner or later. So I want to talk a little bit about subclinical shedders. I feel like in an outbreak situations, outbreaks we've seen, it is not necessarily the sick horse that comes to the show that is the index case. I think people are smart enough to figure out a sick horse should not be at a showground. I believe, and no proof, but I believe that it is the subclinical shedder, horses that are infected, shedding, not displaying clinical signs, that are spreading the love, contaminating the environment and allowing direct or indirect exposure to other horses. And we know that the rate of subclinical shedder, actually we don't know much about the rate of subclinical shedder because there's a lot of factors that will influence it. It's influenced by the population. It's the same with COVID-19 and the different age-based population and the risk of clinical disease versus subclinical shedder. It's a similar parallel in the horse world. So we know that demographic plays a role. We know that time of the year, this is the time of the year, the colder month of the year predisposed to circulation respiratory pathogen. The vaccination status, vaccines are great. However, remember, vaccine when it comes to respiratory pathogen are an aid in disease prevention. There is no sterile immunity. They help, so they milder the clinical outcome. They help with reducing shedding. Horses, unfortunately, if they don't display, they still become infected, are susceptible to infection, and they are still shedding, are, in my opinion, dangerous. During outbreak situation, I never worry about the sick horse. It's a red flag. If you don't recognize a sick horse, we need to talk about that. Regular physical exam, rectal temperature, and so on. I'm worried about the 99.9% of healthy horses still at that showground, in that barn. What's their status? And I don't know until I test. And that's generally not feasible. And we also need to differentiate how does it look in an outbreak situation versus a non-outbreak situation. The rate of subclinical shedder, healthy horses that are infected and shedding, will be way higher in an outbreak situation than in a non-outbreak situation. So the typical poster child of a horse would be that young performance horse in the wintertime going to shows. That's my expected typhoid Mary. So I'm going to show you some data and some metric. And don't ask me what it means, because each of these data set are specific to the population that is tested. So in the spring of 2022, we had the opportunity to collect nasal swab and environmental sample at a larger show in Southern California, at Blenheim. That show ran mid-April for 5 days. So we collected 162 nasal swab. These were all healthy horses. And at the same time, we collected environmental sample. And what did we get out when we tested these nasal swab for a set of respiratory pathogen? We got 2 equine rhinitis B virus cases and 1 strep equi case. I can live with that. I'm not excited. I'm gonna sleep well tonight. If I'm the show vet, I'm not gonna do anything. I mean, that's to be expected. The relevance of equine rhinitis B virus in adult horses, we can debate about that. And the occasional positive strep equi, sure, it's not ideal, but you know what, it's to be expected to some extent. But you can say, okay, well, that's the winter time. You just told me that young horses in the wintertime have a high frequency of shedding respiratory pathogen. So 1.8% is not really high. Let's look at the summertime. So we went to Michigan. This was an 11-week long show. This voluntary, well understood, we're able to collect nasal swab and environmental sample. What did we find? A rate of 2.2%. Again, we have a high frequency of equine rhinitis B virus. I would say this is likely a very minor respiratory pathogen. We got 1 case of EHV4 and 1 case of strep equi. Not really exciting. I mean, considering that there were 1,200 horses at that show, we're doing pretty good. So we could conclude here and say, hey, the prevalence is low. These are irrelevant pathogen. Let's just maybe be less cautious, vaccinate once a year. Let's drop the biosecurity protocol. It's an overkill. Well, I wouldn't do that. If we look during an outbreak situation, this is not exactly an outbreak situation. For how many of you are from California? Almost all of you. Just kidding. 2022 was an honestly really bad year for the equine industry. We had a multi-county outbreak, 10 counties, 21 premise. They all originated from 1 single case. And what the state regulatory officials did to really shortcut this outbreak was to stop the show circuit for 30 days. And it was mandated that every single horse that was going to the next show had to have a negative EHV1 nasal swab. That's a good prevention. So we got all these swab through the UC Davis PCR lab, and I said, hey, why don't we expand after the fact? Why don't we expand it to all respiratory pathogen? And what we found is a high rate of EHV1 positive cases. You would expect we're towards the tail end. So we are, 40, 50 days after the outbreak was declared, there's still HV1 circulating. So you would expect a relatively large number of horses to still be positive. But we have 3.8% of these horses, and these are healthy looking horses. They are ready to go to the next show. We also had other pathogen. We had herpes virus 4, we had equine influenza virus, equine rhinitis B, and strep equi. So the overall rate was 10%. That's pretty high. I wouldn't be happy to know that in the wintertime, the frequency of respiratory pathogen shedding is 10% in a population of sport horses. That would really freak me out. And it takes a lot to freak me out. So that brings me to how relevant is the testing of nasal swabs in comparison to the real risk of what is in the environment. I mean, there's 2 ways that a horse gets infected. Either it's nose-to-nose contact, so you need a horse that is shedding, or it's environmental contamination and indirect spread. Hands, fomites, you just name it. So last year was good. I said it was bad for the industry. It was it was amazing for research and funding. So I was all excited about that. Because honestly, all these outbreaks are tremendous natural resources to study some of these risk factors. So there was one outbreak where we decided to look at alternate sample. For those of you who have shoulder issues and are set on a journey to collect 50 nasal swab, it's not going to be pleasant. Horses don't like it, owners don't like it, somebody's going to get hurt. And that's a reality. So we thought, this would be kind of nice to look at alternate sample. So we collected, we had a lot of fantasy. We collected sample from the nares. It's easy to collect, the front legs where the horses rub their nose. We went down to the rectum, and then a few environmental sample. And we had two populations. We had a population of healthy horses, part of that outbreak, wanted to see at the rate of subclinical shader, and we ended with 2 positive swabs. That's not much. One was a nasal swab, one was a swab collected around the nares. They weren't out the same horse, so not really excited. The second population were horses with clinical disease. So we're expecting these horses to be shedding, and we collected them at different time point. And again, this was a voluntary study with consentment of the owner. What we found is a high rate of positive swab, you would expect, and a high rate of swabs that are easy to collect, swab around the nares and the muzzle. We had a 77% agreement. What's also interesting is alternate sample, definitely non-invasive sample, were testing positive. We had 23% of front limb swabs and environmental sample around the feeding pan, and we had 19% rectal swab and sample around the water trough. Now, rectal swab, you can debate about that, but these are respiratory pathogen. But remember, most of the snot is swallowed. You can expect, to some extent, if the virus survives the GI tract, to have some detection through the feces. But that got us interested into the environment. So what if instead of, I don't even know if it's even English, but what if instead of testing the horses, we end testing the environment and determining the risk of spread and transmission based on environmental sample? How many of you do salmonella environmental testing? It's kind of the same principle. Horse is gone, horse spend the time, I want to see what's left. Okay. So we developed a protocol. We purchased a lot of these lollipops. They're actually not lollipops. They are sponges on a stick, and that little pouch contains 10 milliliters of neutralizing buffer. So they come moist and they're sterile. And we decided to swab stalls. I told you that Blenheim and the Michigan area, we collected environmental swab, and I'll now show you the data. So we focus on environmental swab mostly where horses spend most of their time, which generally in the corner. They get fed in the corner, and they will pace the front of the stall. That's where we use the sponge and sponged away. So I'm going back to the Blenheim, the one in California. Remember, 3 horses, 2 positive for equine rhinitis B virus, 1 positive for strep equi. And I slept good that night. I didn't sleep that well after this one. So we ran 149 environmental sample. We had no positive equine rhinitis B virus and no positive strep equi. So a big mismatch between what we can find in the environment and what the horses are actually shedding. Surprisingly, we had 2 positive EHV4 and we had 5 positive EHV1. And if you look at the distribution of these cases, in this picture, the lower picture represents the barn, the 75 stall. So there's different colors. The green one is a strep equi positive. The 7 stall is an equine rhinitis B nasal secretion positive. The 41 was an EHV4 stall positive. And all these red circles represent EHV1 positive stalls. Does that concern you? They weren't from last year's horses that went to the show. They are from this year's. And what concerns me mostly is the clustering. And there isn't a single sick horse in there. And they all tested negative in nasal secretion for EHV1. So what does this data mean? I don't know. It's just discrepant, puzzling. And it's not an issue with technology. You are not spiking this sample with EHV1. I mean, I don't hope so. No. Technician said no, we're not. Oh yeah. So just let's keep this in mind. We did the same with the sample set for Michigan. That was in the summertime. We had 2.2% of these tests positive. We were all over the place. So we had, one flow, 3 EHV1, 13 EHV4, 3 equine rhinitis B, and then 1 strep equi. And if you remember from the horses that we tested before, similar frequency, just different pathogen, we had mostly strep equi and equine rhinitis B virus. So to me, there's a big discrepancy. And the question is, which one of the two freaks us out? Which one of the two is more reliable? Maybe we need the two. I know that swabbing or taking nasal swab in all these horses is a very short time frame. These horses will shed for a shorter period of time. I like the environment because I feel this is a build-up. These horses will spend 95% of their time in the stall. These pathogens, I'm not looking at biology of these pathogens. I don't care if it's viable or not. It's probably going to be the next step, because the question is, well, what does a PCR positive result mean? Not much, unless you know that the virus is lytic or non-lytic. Am I right? But it's to me a reflection of what's coming out the horse over time. But it's also a reflection of the silent spread. And I think this is what happens during this outbreak. You got subclinical transmission that happens until it hits either the right population or certain threshold. And then something hits the fan, and it's not pretty. Because what we generally monitor is the horse that is on the ground and flopping, all right? That's the horse with acute onset of neurological sign that is deemed to have EHM. Well, guess what this horse has been doing for the past 10 days? Spreading the love, right and left. So by the time you have an EHM case, you may as well dig a hole. There's no way you're gonna get out of that. That event is done, because you don't know how far that virus has spread. People are looking at me, it's like, I'm not quite sure if I agree with that. Dr. Mayer, I'll ask you the question later. Okay, so I'll finish at some point. Are we good on time there? Harry, are we good? Okay, he says yes. Yeah. So let's go back in an outbreak situation. I only have data for EHV1. I know it's a lot of table, a lot of data, but it's just a trend. So we were invited to Thermal to actually swab horses. That was last year, and collect environmental sample. And thank you to Floxergy, because Floxergy provides the manpower. They are awesome. Eric, he's awesome swabber. The guy, if you need a swabber, he'll fly everywhere and swab environment only. He's the king. So we decided to swab horses and the environment, thinking, it's one of the first study we did, thinking that we would have a parallel data. So, what we find in a nasal secretion, what we find in the environment will be very similar. What we found, if we looked at nasal secretion, we had a high frequency of EHV1 positive horses, and these are all healthy horses. The sick horses have been taken out and they're already living in isolation. We had no access to these horses. These are all healthy looking horses. The interesting part, if you look at the column on the left, these are the barn numbers. The one with the asterisks are the one that had clinical cases. So diagnosed clinical cases were moved out to isolation. And you recognize that 5 of these 6 positive cases actually originated from barns with no previous EHV1 diagnosed cases. So it just tells you how permissive this virus is, how easily it permeates and moves around. It doesn't really matter how, if it's hands, if it's rug, if horse, veterinarian. I mean, we are risk factors. If you look at some of these studies, we're considered risk factors. Now, the more interesting part is stall sponges. We had 28 stall sponges. 26 out of these stall sponges originated from horses that tested negative on nasal secretion. 2 of these stalls were from horses that had recently been moved to isolation. The stall hadn't been cleaned. So that there's a good parallel. And it kind of worries me, but this is, again, it's during an outbreak situation. So, we always debate what should we do during an outbreak situation. And are there any regulatory officials here? Whew, am I safe here? Okay. So I'm always about, hey, let's test. I mean, what's the worst thing? We find something and we have to act on it. Am I right? But if we don't know, and remember, this is 28 days. 28 days after the initial outbreak. So we are towards the end of that quarantine. And I still have positive horses. And I still have positive stalls. That worries me. I'm worried. Still sleeping good. So no worries about that. Okay, so a different topic. I'm going back to COVID. I'm really fixated on that one. I love the technology that really came out of that outbreak or that pandemic. I mean, some of you may not see the good of it. I think we have made a tremendous scientific leap in technology. And one of them is the gigantic vacuum cleaner here, the air sampler. Air sampling has been used a lot to monitor population environment in the field of SARS-CoV-2. Great technology. The problem with air sampling is there's not a lot of biomass floating around. So you don't get fat by breathing air. That's what I'm trying to say. There's not a lot of floating protein, DNA, and RNA. There's very little. And it needs to be concentrated. Hence, you need to have a technology. You need to have the Dyson of all the air sample. You need to have the one that knows how to suck air and then to filter it. And the technology is there. You gotta have one that is powerful. And unfortunately, all this technology comes through the human field, so you can imagine how much it costs. It's not dirt cheap. But still, worthwhile pursuing. Now, if you look at air sampling, it's done commonly in the poultry and swine industry to monitor for viruses. But it's not done by applying that air sample in the middle of the barn, going and take a break, and then come back half an hour later, which a lot of people imagine. It's perfect. Let's get that air sample, let's put it in the middle of the barn, it's running for half an hour, and let's test it. Well, you can give me a call. I can tell you it's going to be negative. Because if one horse is one end, 50 yards down the barn, you won't be able to capture it. So we need to develop, what I'm trying to say is the technology may be great, saving times, allowing us to really monitor these shows, but we need to develop a protocol. And I think probably the best protocol is just to walk around and kick up some of the shavings. You got dust, bioparticle, and then just move around and do that on a regular basis. I mean, it would be easy to do, fairly cost effective, I believe. Okay, we're at the end. What I'm trying to say here, and I don't have the answer. I'm just, I don't know, digging a hole. I'm just bringing up some ideas. When it comes to clinical disease, I think we're good and well covered. Despite the fact that we missed some cases, probably, we're still good covered. We had a great discussion yesterday. We're talking about PCR, how we use PCR. Remember, these diagnostic tests are an aid. If that horse walks and talks like it has a respiratory infection that tests negative, we're not going to put that horse and commingle that horse with other horses. We're still going to use common sense. We're still going to isolate that horse, potentially retest. So new technology is 100% accurate. I mean, the technology is accurate towards the result, but not necessarily to biological status of the horse. When it comes to all these show horses, we realize that swabbing all these horses is not feasible, not sustainable, and pointless, because their shedding is short and transient, meaning that a negative horse today may be positive tomorrow. Unless we swab all these horses every day, and we're looking at showgrounds with 2,700 horses, I'm not going to sign up for that one. Okay? No matter what the pay is. So we need to find other ways. So environmental monitoring to me makes more sense, like you would monitor salmonella in your hospital. Why? It's because you're worried about nosocomial transmission. So what protocol? I don't know. I mean, this is very preliminary. I can only tell you that at the Desert International Horse Park that is running right now, we're doing 3 sets of sampling. We're sampling every single stall, 2,700 stalls. I'm not the one that does it. And you say, like, this is insane. That doesn't make sense. It's stupid. You're entitled to think that way. I respect that. So think about it. That outbreak cost over $10 million. They had to shut down the circuit for 3 weeks. That's a lot of change, all right? So what we do is we collect swab, we pull 10 stalls per swab. I don't care which stall is positive, there's one positive. I just need to know that the virus is present or is not absent. And we only focus on the HV1. That's what the show organizers very much fixate. I wonder why. You can do it in the middle of the show and see what happens. And again, it's not that individual positive stall or pool of stall that would worry me. It's the clustering. It's that aggregation of positive stall for the same pathogen. It just tells you there's active transmission. These are, in my opinion, the dangerous ones. And it's going to be interesting to see in the next few years. Maybe they'll invite me back, probably not. But if they invite me back and you guys are still around, maybe in a few years I can share some data on air sampling. I'd love to hear your experience, your thoughts. You guys are puzzled. I get it. Question here up front.
Could you, by any chance, break these down into the neuropathogenic?
Yeah, very good question. So the question is genotype. Is this neuropathic or non-neuropathic? Yes, we did, but I don't remember the data. So yes, I do remember the data for some. The outbreak in thermal, that was caused by a non-neuropathic, N752. So all the data from stall and horses were related to the N752. Actually, I have a talk this afternoon on genotype and relevance, not relevance, but frequency of genotype in contemporary. That genotype nomenclature has been one of the worst nightmare ever brought out there. How do you explain to a veterinarian that neurologically affected horse is infected by EHV1 and that EHV1 is a non-neurotropic genotype? That doesn't make sense. There's a lot of confusion, am I right? Horse is neurologic but infected with a non-neurologic virus? Mind-blowing, am I right? So it's real, but the issue is in the terminology. And to answer your question, how many of you experienced EHM outbreak recently? Or sporadic case of EHM, or diagnosed EHM? Only one person? They're all going to flock to you, or they're all going to refer to you. I was just asking because genotype. We always looked at EHM associated with D752, the neuropathic. There's been like the direct association with historical data. And we know that if we look at contemporary data, 2019 to 2022, 75% of EHM cases, EHM outbreak, are caused by a non-neurotropic genotype. So the point is, genotype sounds sexy, but it's irrelevant in the face of EHM. Both genotype can cause all the disease stages or disease presentation, rhinopneumonitis, abortion, and EHM. So the color of the virus really doesn't matter. But from an epidemiological standpoint, it is interesting. Question in the back?
The origin of the environmental sample, do you think they are getting it from nasal swab is coming back negative, but you're still getting a positive in the stall, correct?
Correct. That's one conclusion that we can draw from like 4 different studies. There is no association between what we find in the environment, I mean there's a few exceptions, and what the horse is shedding. And the question is, why?
Is there a different sample that would be better than the nasal swab, such as oral fluids? I'm a pig guy. I used to research pigs.
Yeah.
And we do oral fluids all the time.
Yeah.
Right? So rabies, herpes virus, find all sorts of things. If you swab pigs, swab something else that is specific oral fluid correlated to virus.
Well, we tried, nares, rectum, feces, and so these are horses. You still have to go individual. I mean, with pigs, you can put like a chewing rope and then it's perfect because they're in a group. You can sample the environments or an area. You can sample the water. I mean, in the perfect world, I would say, I don't know how to do that. You encourage everybody to let their horses drink out the same water trough. You only have one single water trough for 2,700 horses, and that's where everybody's going to be drinking. And on a daily basis, you collect a water sample. We know these pathogens, especially strep equi, can be detected. I have not found anything specific. Now, I'm on the quest to find something. One idea that I thought is a little patch. So you get a patch that you put in a stall. As you put the horse in your stall, so you get stall number, you get the patch. You're sticking potentially in a corner where the horse spends a lot of time, and then you can peel that patch and test it by PCR on a regular basis. You can even pool the patches. If there is no issue, you can just leave the patch till the next horse comes in. You put a new patch. So that patch reflects horse shedding over time. what I realized is these, and it's very specific to these show horses. If we were dealing with yearlings or weanlings, this would look different. We would have a better overlap between what we find in nasal secretion, most of the time they get sick as well, and what is in the environment. But we're dealing with horses that are lying to you. They're telling you, I'm not shedding, I'm not shedding, I'm shedding, and they turn around and they're shedding. And if they shed for a short period of time. I like the environment, but again, are we missing it? Probably to some extent, but we're capturing quite a, single digit, I understand, quite a large number of relevant pathogen. And I was actually surprised. I thought, first of all, it's going to be so diluted, there's no way we're going to find one. Second, I thought, this is environmental science, it's going to be so inhibitory, it's not even going to be worth it. And then Samantha brings back the result, and I'm like, huh, what? Now I've got to explain it, thank you. So I'm still struggling. What is the dynamic? What is the kinetic? We will follow up, actually, we'll follow up with an experimental study, EHV4. Strangely, university doesn't let me infect horses with EHV1. I wonder why. So they gave me the alternative, EHV4. We're going to infect horses with EHV4, and we're going to sample the environment on a regular basis. The idea is, what is the correlate between what they shed in the environment? When the horse stops shedding nasal secretion, how long can we still pursue the pathogen in the environment? And ideally, we would like to look at viability, because PCR positive result is meaningless in the context of biology. It's just pretty DNA. I don't even know if it's pretty, but it's DNA. It's nucleic acid that we detect. I want to know what happened if I put a susceptible horse in that stall. Is that horse going to get sick? I don't know. So we're just scratching the surface here. But I think what the interesting part is, sometimes you have to think outside the box. And nobody has been really happy with the protocols that we have. Because no matter what you do, they are time consuming, they are very costly, nobody wants to comply with them. If we bring some metric, I don't think the data looks bad, but at least it's a beginning. And I always want to say, this data is very specific for each group of horses. So if you go to next year, different group of horses, it may look slightly different. So there are variation in the shedding, but the trends are generally the same. Any other questions? Looks, feels, tastes like lunch, am I right? Thanks for joining. Thanks Fluxology for having me.